Yeah, I'm Badly Licked Bear, and I use she and they pronouns.
Thank you. The first question that I'm asking everybody is really just about you as a person.
hmm
Um, really, who are you? And can you tell us about who you are as a person before we talk about art? And how do you tell your story?
Um, this is always a big one for me because I'm an adoption survivor. So whenever I get into the whole world of like, where am I from or who are my people, like, it's like I have twice as many ancestors as like many people do. So I was sold in 1978 to a white identifying Jewish family. And so on in terms of my body, my bodily ancestors are indigenous and settler colonial. So I'm indigenous, French, Scottish, and English. And my adoptive ancestors on that side of the family are Ukrainian and Russian Jews who emigrated to the United States through both Brooklyn and Canada, followed by Brooklyn to Los Angeles, which I feel like is a very typical path for those folks. So I have that kind of doubling of ancestry. I was raised both within Jewish religious schools and also like completely outside of my indigenous heritage, which I did not think was important as a kid because, like, you're raised as an American in the United States, and so you think, like, great, I'm kind of yellow colored. Like, I look like the future of America as it dreams of itself. And then by the time you're like I'm 47 right now. So like I was in middle school when the Rodney King riots happened and when the Gulf War started. And so that was a really, as someone who's at the tail end of Gen X, my political and identity awakening kind of is dated to that moment of like, of MTV and the 18-month build up to the Iraq War and my city being on fire and being from the South Bay in Los Angeles. So I grew up in the South Bay, I grew up in suburbia, and like you could like from the hill where I was born, you could see the city on fire in a way, and then you could feel the tension of my neighbors, who were upper middle class people and middle class people at the time, that like they were gonna come and take their stuff, and burn their homes, and like that was gonna happen. And I'm like, well, I'm they, so that's kind of my background. I have a dear friend, and she once described me as a professional code switcher, which is to say that I'm somebody who's both trained and, for reasons of the way I'm enculturated, like I slide in and out of different cultures and different groups, and I think that's a pretty good description of who I am and what I am. I'm trans. I'm a transsexual woman. I'm a third gender indigiqueer person. I came out as a transgender person in 1994 when I was 16. So I'm trans and old. I came out at a time when transitioning was effectively playing Russian roulette. I came out at a time when the average age of a transgender woman like myself was 35. And I've lived past that point. So I also see myself as somebody who was kind of set up not to survive to adulthood and then not to survive their adulthood, and yet has done that. And I think I speak from that place of surviving the circumstances of my birth, surviving the circumstances of a very violent youth, and surviving the circumstances of finding out how to live into a full adulthood as a transsexual and transgender person in the United States of America.
Thank you. Well, you bring up this interesting relationship to code switching,
hmm
right? And I'm wondering, you mentioned that you also have indigenous ancestry,
hmm
and I'm wondering, like, what do you see as your relationship to indigeneity
hmm
as somebody who, as in your own words, kind of was disconnected from that
hmm
growing up?
I mean, I think there's a lot of ways that one can think about that. I did not eat, I'm somebody who was coded by others as Mexican as a kid. I discovered that I wasn't white, essentially, because I kind of thought of myself as like mixed race, but kind of like white passing as a kid. I discovered I wasn't white the first time somebody called me to my face a beaner, right? That was like the moment of like, oh, like people don't think of me like I think of myself. It was easy to think of myself as blending in with white people because I went to Hebrew school, and a lot of Jews are olive skinned. A lot of Jews don't blend in well with white people either, even though Jews are considered to be provisionally white in the United States, right? So that's a huge part of that sense. And then I was also somebody who was called a beaner but didn't eat a tortilla until they were like 13 or 14 years old. And my first tortilla was from Taco Bell, which required a tremendous amount of negotiation with my adoptive family to go to Taco Bell because like I was endangering my life by eating Mexican food in the racist views of my family. To eat Mexican food was to invite illness and death. And that's, disgusting. But I'm from Los Angeles, which is a majority indigenous city. Los Angeles is 49% Hispanic and Latino by identification, and 1.2 or 1.4% Native or indigenous by identification. This is a majority indigenous city. It is run by indigenous people. We provide all of the labor in this city. And that's how I prefer to think of Los Angeles as a city. This is an indigenous city in the United States. It lives under the United States as a colonized, unceded territory that is primarily populated by indigenous people and will continue to be an indigenous majority city. That's how I see the culture that I live in. Like a lot of the indigenous people who live in Los Angeles, I'm like a city Indian. I'm somebody who grew up in urban society, had very little connection with tribal identity, had very little connection with indigenous identity outside of tribal identity, and I didn't know how I fit in that way until I was like in my early 30s. It was a part of me, but it wasn't something that was a political part of me, and it wasn't a political part of me because I felt outside the culture enough that I had no interest in taking up space from other indigenous people, right? When I was in my 30s, I started working with more indigenous people and like meeting other indigenous people who had been like sold, who were elders, who had like been in residential schools, and indigenous people who didn't know their language ever and like were raised as Catholic or whatnot. I also started meeting other indigenous adoptees, many of whom had much clearer pathways to reconnecting with their community or their tribal background than I have. And navigating that space, and then navigating during the pandemic, getting more engaged with Navajo Nation. There are people who think I'm Navajo because I'm the Navajo Nation van driver for the Auntie Sewing Squad. So there are people who, I remember meeting with a Korean guy who really fetishized Navajo people very specifically, and the craziest weird way, and he's like, you don't look Navajo. He was really excited to give us donations because he would get to spend time with a real Navajo person, and I'm like, I just drive the van, man. And being held by that community, and also working with other indigenous communities, including indigenous communities in British Columbia on the other side of the medicine line, has been really enlightening in terms of finding my place in indigenous community and not really worrying too much about certain things. There's a great quote from a woman who is Cherokee and does a lot of work, in the nation, and again, it's mixed race. Most indigenous people are mixed race. And she said, I'm 100% indigenous. And so I oftentimes say this, I'm 100% indigenous. I'm 100% of everything that I am. And if dealing with a person with my diversity, who's 500, 600, 700% of things is awkward or weird or uncomfortable for you, then you get to deal with your own percentages. That's, I am all of those things. I am all of those things in the way that I am.
Thank you. Well, you mentioned that you grew up in the South Bay.
Yeah.
And, one of the questions we have is asking folks where they're from, and specifically the South Bay is it's a specific geography has a specific history. So I'm wondering if you could tell us how this particular place informs your identity.
Well, I was raised in Rancho Palos Verdes, which is like one of the wealthiest communities in America, and I was like, alive during the time of Reagan, as it were, and as somebody who grew up in this incredibly privileged environment, that's also weirdly natural in the way that like rich people live in places that have more nature than poor people, because there's hills that can't be developed, so there's less area in Malibu, in Palos Verdes, in the Hollywood Hills, and other parts of LA, Eagle Rock, places where rich people live, like that can't be developed. So you are in contact with like nature, or you're in contact with the ocean. You're in contact with seasonality in a way that people in South Central and to some degree the Valley and these big sort of under thought of places in LA aren't. But at the same time, I grew up under Reagan, and my family, my adoptive family, was like a lot of middle class families growing up under Reagan. They were experiencing financial ruin during recession after recession after recession, and we lost our home, And so, a huge part of my experience of being like a beach kid from the South Bay is also like learning how to be poor. Like learning what it means to be poor was pretty important to me by the time I was 9 or 10. It was really clear to me by the time I was like entering middle school that I was like the poorest kid I knew and was getting poorer. Like I was wearing like hand-me-down clothes and like from my adoptive father who was 6'1" and I'm 5'2" or 3. So it was like awkward. I was like wearing this giant jacket to school and like had one pair of shoes, and they were like the hiking shoes that I wore because I was like in scouts and stuff. And I was a troubled youth. And so my world of the South Bay is a world that's informed by the harbor area in Pedro and Lomita and Torrance, because like the places where I would be traveling to score hard drugs for those communities and stuff. My friends in high school, I went to continuation school. My friends in high school were like in Asian gangs and like gangs in Pedro. And so I took a pretty rapid kind of like downhill slide from living on what's called the Hill to, by the time I was 17, I'm a high school dropout. I ended up living in the harbor area. And so, I spent the first 17 years of my life living in Palos Verdes, and I spent a lot of the second 17 years of my life, not all of it, but a big chunk of it, living in San Pedro and being like someone from the harbor area, to the point where people think of me as someone who's from San Pedro. I don't misrepresent myself as someone who was born there, which is very serious politic for San Pedro, but I'm fucking from Pedro. Like, I'm absolutely Pedro. And I'm really proud, as someone who like grew up rough in Pedro when Pedro was still rough, that I was able to like then go and become the program director for Angels Gate Cultural Center. By the time I was like in my mid-20s, I was the director. I started working there at 22. I started working in the arts at 17, like working in community college art galleries, doing, manual labor. And, so I was like, I'm somebody who is connected with that place as it is rough or was rough. Someone who's living in a union household for most of their 20s and a longshore household, and became the director for what was at the time like one of the only cultural institutions in the South Bay. When I started working at Angels Gate, there was basically the Long Beach Museum of Art and us, and so it kind of was like getting to invent the art world, because like I hadn't gone to college, I didn't have an MFA, I was like too dumb to know anything, and my bosses and the people I worked with were also like not art world people in a real way. So I didn't get the system. So I kind of invented a fantasy art world that I was living in for most of my 20s. So,
Thank you. Well, I also want to get us to talk about your art, because I know you have a very multidisciplinary art practice.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you can tell us about your art, and really what I'm asking is, what sort of art do you make, and why are you driven to make it? And what sorts of topics do you explore in your art, and what political relevance does it have for the advocacy you're a part of?
So, I'm a mid-career person at this point, so this is like a long story, but I'll try to keep it. I think there's two phases in my career as an artist. As a younger person, I was incredibly empowered economically because I had a full-time job in the arts world. I was not well paid, but I had a real job. I was in a position of power and authority, and I'm also like a big nerd. And so I was able to make like what I think in retrospect were like really inaccessible, massive works. I would basically have like one show a year, and I would like take over the venue, and I would make whatever I wanted to make and use the space as a essentially as like like a program space, because I was a curator, so I've curated like 225 shows or something like that before I retired in my early 30s. And so I would like just take over things, do what I wanted. At the beginning of my art career, I was using like 8-bit graphics, like Nintendo graphics, to tell personal stories about violence and teen violence. And I walked away from that pretty quick when I realized that families were buying my art to decorate their kids' rooms and shit. 'Cause they're like, it's like I was gonna be like a collectible or something. I was like, fuck that. That's not what I'm about. And then I spent much of my 20s making a body of work over 5 years about avian flu. So I don't talk about this as much as I think a more career-oriented person would. So basically from 2005 to 2009, I exclusively worked on the topic of the information and narrative space around pandemics, and particularly the upcoming avian flu pandemic, which we have been expecting for 20 to 30 years now. This is a very complicated topic. So an easy way to say it is I spent a lot of my time making very intellectual work about an incredibly important social issue that relates to the deaths of millions that will happen as part of the cyclical nature of pandemics. And nobody gave a shit. Nobody gave a shit. People were all very nice to me, and all my work was like massive and involved these huge wall paintings and stuff. And but nobody really was engaged with the topic, which is like how Americans are now. Like Americans aren't engaged with the topic of the millions of people who've died under COVID, who will die from COVID, who will live shorter lives because of long COVID, who are permanently disabled because of long COVID. Another way of looking at this work is that like I've made a lot of work that is seen by some of the people who are around me as like very apocalyptic in orientation and to some degree prophetic. I feel like I've moved away from that because no one really gives a shit. I'm not interested in like, I'm not really interested at this point in like telling people what the future is going to be like, because nobody gives a shit. I'm interested in shaping what the future is going to be like, or preparing to live in the future, and preparing those closest to me to live in that future. I made that work. I was working as a curator. I retired. I went to grad school. I exited grad school in 2 ways. I had become a professor, and which was unexpected. That's not why I went to grad school. I went to grad school because I thought I wasn't getting good jobs in the industry, and I was like always like I was always the finalist. I was like the finalist to curate this biennial or something from the State Department. I was the finalist for that, but I was never like the bride, right? And I realized, eventually I came to realize that it's like, oh yeah, like the art world isn't a place for queer people, and it's not a place for people who aren't white. And so that's why I wasn't not getting the jobs. So I didn't have a master's degree. I wasn't getting the jobs because I wasn't like performing whiteness. I wasn't getting the job because like I wasn't performing like heteronormativity in some kind of way. It took a long time to realize that, and I have a lot of debt as part of that realization. But I came out in that state. I also came out much more conscious about like the importance of political work, and I came out very sick. So I had developed an autoimmune condition at that point. And a lot of my work became performance work about being in a body and about being sick at that point, which I didn't articulate to people. I made a lot of really dangerous performance work for about 5 years that involved me eating things that I'm not supposed to eat, oftentimes in grotesque quantities, oftentimes in like a really sexually debased situation. And so my work kind of shifted at the same time my life shifted in a lot of ways. At the same time, I had left this intellectual phase of my work and I was living on what I call planet sex work. So that became my community. It was like basically like, pro doms and sex workers. They became my political community. And then it took a long time to be really sick before I moved into a phase in my work where I started like working with comics and telling stories and working more with narrative and continuing to make performance work that is to some degree dangerous to a sick body. Oftentimes like very explicit sexual performance work, which has, I think, rendered my work. I don't want to. It's like I make the work I want to make, and like I remember doing a performance in like 2017, and a friend of mine, who's an art writer named Matt Stromberg, showed up to see the performance, and he was walking downstairs, exiting, and a friend of mine who was late was walking upstairs. This is at Human Resources, in like the upstairs back corner, and he said, I think I just saw someone suck a dick," which I think as like a heterosexual man was like a complete new experience for him. I mean, except for presumably his own experiences within heterosexuality, and then I remember Matt the next day sending me a photo of the performance, which is like the back of my head. It's like not graphic in any way. And he didn't say anything really too specific, but it was like very clear, like, it's a shame I can't write about your work. And so I feel like a lot of people who live on planet sex work, a lot of people who make work that's about the body, my work has always been really difficult to document for people. Like huge installations I made in my 20s were hard to document for people, because they would be made on site. And so reviewers review the show, like they're like looking at slides and shit that are sent to them. Like, this is the painting that will be in the show. And it's like, well, my work doesn't exist until day one, And so like oftentimes I would not get, it's like, I've always kind of like enjoyed being outside or being impossible to kind of like present in any of the media that we normally discuss art in. And so that makes me happy.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate like this long career arc that you're sort of describing. And I don't want to project politics, but everything is political.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, given sort of these varied interests that you have that I do think have deep political commentary and social engagement, what do you see as the role of artists in articulating political critique, and why does this work matter to you?
I mean, it's really apparent if you spend any time looking at like the top tier of the art world, that what artists are primarily selling at this point is access to identity, and the politics of that identity. So like the Y-Bi just got, the new Whitney Biennial crew just got announced, and like every year people I know are in it. And it's like, okay, cool, I know why you're in it. Like, your identity is a politicized identity, and you will get some money, or maybe, I don't even know how it really works this way, but like you get to go to New York, and like you get to like be in the art world, in that bubble of parties and that proximity to luxury and the consumption of luxury. And like a lot of my friends who are in these things, they're playing this game. They know this game. I'm not trying to talk shit on them. Like, this is part of what it means. And at the same time, why are you there? You're there because like you're palatably politicized in some kind of way, So, like, will the Whitney Biennial change anything? It will change nothing. What would change something is if the Whitney Biennial didn't happen. Like, that might change something, right? Like, if it didn't happen for a reason. And there's a lot of, that's kind of like where you're going when you're an artist. You're going to this world where you're like turning your identity into some kind of way. And this even extends to like white cisgender male artists, who are very privileged people in theory. They have a kind of identity that is consumed by a certain kind of consumer in the art world. It's like you move into this consumptive practice. So like that's where I feel like the politics of the art world are primarily concerned. And so I'm going to continue to be inspired and make work in the realm of people who I think have actually created change in my community. And that's going to be like people like Ron Athey or Michelle Carr, who are like performance artists who were like performing at Club Fuck in the 80s, you know, who then go on to do whatever they want to do, like when they interact in the art world, you know, as opposed to like, you know, there's another world where like Ron is really rich for selling a lot of pictures of Ron or something like that, or you know what I mean? And you know, I saw Michelle go on to like found the Velvet Hammer burlesque troupe, which basically invented neo burlesque in the United States, which is a major, you know, like a major touchstone for America's sex work population. So that's where I see the politics being relevant, is like being as low to the ground as possible, as being in the community as possible, as being in discourse. I was recently in an exhibition at Human Resources, which is pretty much the only place I show in LA at this point. And there were a lot, and it was like an exhibition of like all trans and gender diverse artists and stuff. And like, I don't have the same politics as some of those people. Like, I don't share the same radical gender ideologies as those people, as everybody in the show. And I think that's great. I think that's fucking great. So I am interested in being in situations that are politicized, like that involve like the sex work community or the trans community, when like we're actually disagreeing amongst ourselves, as opposed to like having a dialogue that runs counter to culture, like having a community that actually has enough fire that like we're throwing Molotov cocktails at each other. That turns me on.
Yeah, no, I love that about your vision too, because I think your comment about sort of the consumption of identity, it makes me think about the limits of like symbolic resistance. You know, like a lot of artists use political discourse, but very rarely are they in community or are they leading to material practices, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's something that your work speaks to, right? How to move beyond the symbolic and sort of the identitarian consumption into like communities that are engaging in a different way of being.
I do want to say that there is no ethical consumption or capitalism, and so in the sense that I am consumed, it will be in an ethical manner, you know, and yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Now, I kind of want to pivot a little bit because, you know, part of this project is to work with One Institute and the LA LGBTQ Arts and Culture Coalition to really think about the supports that people in the community need. So the first question I have for you is a specific one, then we'll move to general. And the first one is, what sort of support do you in particular need as a culture worker, and how does this intersect with your gender identity and role as a creative?
As a culture worker, I need to be paid and I need to be respected on the basis of my resume and skills. As many people know, because I'm a loudmouth, I was the highest paid person in the part-time tier over at Otis College until I found myself suddenly less and less employed the moment I transitioned. I led the largest department at Otis for years as an administrator. I was teaching a full-time load, which is legal. Essentially, Otis was employing me and other people illegally in what's called an overload. I carried my department through the pandemic. I was on the committee that designed Otis's institutional vision statement. I invented class after class. You know, I was like literally designing curriculum. I supervised more people than any person at the college, with the exception of the provost at one point. I was supervising other faculty, and the minute, and I want to make it clear, I have friends who disagree with me on this. I have friends who are like, no, you didn't suddenly lose every position of power and leadership you had because you're trans. You lost everything because you're a woman. We fight about this all the time, and it's like, and it's funny and it's interesting, you know. It's like, so I won't know how that works. Like, was it misogyny? Was it transphobia? The answer is it's both, but I know what it means. I know what it feels like to be a leader at a cultural institution. I know what it feels like to make enough money that you live in a nice home. I know what it feels like to lose your home. I know what it feels like to lose my health insurance. I know what it feels like to lose every fucking piece of material comfort that a person who is successful in like year 25 or something of their career can lose when they transition. And I think there's a very specific politic at work here. Being trans, being gender diverse is not a condition of mental illness. In other words, like, it's not like, oh, who are these poor people who have gender dysphoria? First of all, gender dysphoria is not a diagnostic criteria for transgender people. The term is gender incongruence. It's not in the DSM. It's not a mental health condition. We are not poor, sick people who, like, if not given our gender affirming care, will like slit our wrists in the fucking bathtub. We are human beings. We have a gender. We have a sexuality. We have a sex. You know, we're like any other people. And we live in a society that does not support those notions, right? And amongst ourselves, we have different interpretations of what that means. But what happens to a person in their career is like, I think maybe if you're a gender nonconforming or trans person, people are like, oh, how can we help this mentally ill, like subhuman person, like survive and maybe not kill themselves out of sheer sadness? So I'll give them a tiny grant, you know. But then people like me are really problematic, you know. So it's like, what happens when somebody who's like engaged in institutional leadership informs people, oh, guess what? I've been this complex, diverse person the whole time. You are suddenly going to be viewed as if you have been stricken by madness and are a subhuman person and cannot be trusted with any authority, including authority on DEI topics, on topics specific to queer and trans people. You know, there are very few organizations or institutions where the person in the position of the executive director slot or the program director slot is themselves trans and is serving trans people. And when people are in those slots, they're oftentimes people who identify as transgender or not medically transgender in any way. You know, not to like create a hierarchy there of any kind, but they're people who fundamentally have like less dramatic transition experiences, less impactful transition experiences than those of us who do things like, you know, like have our skull rewired, you know, or like get major plastic surgery, or like change our actual sex through hormonal changes to the body. So, yeah, it's like, put us in charge, pay us like human beings. And for some people who are in leadership, it's going to mean you have to realize that you need to actually step out of leadership and put people like me into leadership.
Yeah. I really appreciate the answer. I mean, there's so much that you're bringing up about sort of just, I think about complex personhood, right? It's not about flattening identities or to this like this discourse around not only mental illness, but about like the suffering trans person that needs to be saved, right? But you know, because we are working with the coalition, because we are working to think about how to support community members, I wonder if you could speak more generally what you think are the most pressing needs, specifically for BIPOC, trans, and gender nonconforming artists who face not only racism and violent anti-trans rhetoric, but also the undervaluation of creative labor.
I mean, it's going to come down to, like, you know, again, living wages. There are real, I mean, first of all, I'm on the steering committee for the coalition, and I'm on the steering committee for Circa at the One Institute. So I'm in a position of tremendous, like, privilege relative to some other people in the community. That privilege isn't paying my bills, right? But I am in a position of privilege and access that other people aren't. And I am in those positions of privilege and access because I'm either doing tremendously underpaid labor or because I'm volunteering my time, and that's a choice that I make. I'm aware of the limitations of these forces. So it's like, I need access to healthcare, like everybody in this country needs access to healthcare. That's like beyond the capacity of these kinds of entities. What I do need is absolute spine when it comes to facing realities. I recently presented on behalf of the coalition to the LA County LGBTQ plus arts, their own art commission. And there was a committee member who was like visibly upset when I explained to him that the state of California is not considered a safe place for trans kids. Like in his mind, this man, who I'm going to presume is a gay man, right? He could be a cisgender, he could be a cisgender straight man, but I presume he's a gay man. Like the idea that California is not a safe place for trans kids, like I could see how it absolutely like challenged and he was like pushing back because whether it's heteronormativity or homonormativity and like the idea that the Democratic Party and like the institutions of state will protect trans kids in this blue state, and there's a trans person in front of him saying like the thing you believe is not real. Like it is a distinctly unsafe place in the United States right now, and I need people who are in a position of power to constantly speak about trans and gender nonconforming issues as if we're in a civil rights crisis, and as if the majority of American states are places that are violently dangerous for us to live, places where we can't work, places where we have no freedom of movement, places where we can't get housing, like in the same way as other people. It's not, we can't just not get housing because we don't have money. Like there are people who will not give us housing. And I think any gay person, any BIPOC person should know what that was. That is in the lived experience of people in our community, of having landlords not willing to rent for you, people not willing to hire you, right? And being in this kind of downward spiral. So anything that reverses that is what I need, and I need strong voices to consistently to talk about these issues as if they're a civil rights issue more than they are a medical issue. I think that's, again, we're not a medical, we're not the LGBTQ plus medical coalition. We are an art and culture coalition.
I think like you're laying out sort of the groundwork for the next question, which is our final question, which is to think about futurity, right? Like what are we working towards, right? I think we can, like you've laid out a lot of the challenges, and the last question that I have is perhaps Pollyanna, but I hope you can bear with me. What is your vision for a trans future, and what does trans liberation look like for you?
Trans liberation, again, as somebody who came out in the 90s and made decisions about transition and gender in the 90s under those realities, trans liberation is now. It is right. This is it. I know shit's bad. I know we are technically on step whatever of a defined genocide. And we are only at that step because we have chosen to liberate ourselves. We have chosen to use the tools that have been created in the past 20 to 25 years to liberate ourselves. This is trans liberation. I grew up in the 1990s, and the people I knew who were trans were very few and far between, and they were old, and they were very, very, very poor. And they had lived their life with one truth, let me transition, let me live as I am, and let me die as I am. That was the only thing they could look forward to. I can go to a dozen trans events this week in LA if I want to. I can go to trans night at a bar, right? I can be in the same room with transgender people every fucking day. I am in a relationship with a transgender person, we have community in a way we never had before. So I can't live in this moment and deny the quantity of liberation that I have seen happen in my lifetime. I want that to keep happening. I understand that is not history is not an upward progression towards justice. And I don't believe that the arc of history bends towards justice either. That's too convenient. The future is unknown. The work I'm going to do today is for a generation that I will never meet. And if you do your work for liberation and your work for civil rights with the idea that the beneficiary of it will be someone who has never met you, has never heard your name, does not appreciate you, will not give you flowers or praise, then you are probably doing it from the right place. So that's the trans future to me is unknown, right? Other than the fact that I know that being trans is an essential gender quality to the human species. It has nothing to do with healthcare. It has zero to do with healthcare. We were here before modern medicine. We'll be here after modern medicine. We are a fire that cannot be put out. We will always be here. We have always been here in one way or another. We are liberating ourselves, and no matter how fucking bad it gets, it's like we're like the Terminator. We'll be back, right? We're gonna like crawl out of the flames or something and be like yeah, it won't playing whack-a-mole with the human species incredibly beautiful, complex gender diversity itself will not work. You will not win whack-a-mole against yourself. You're just hitting yourself in the fucking face with that stupid foam bat. So that's my future is unknown, but it's here whether you like it or fucking not.
That's it. Amazing.
Cool.
So I knew you were gonna give fire answers.